In the skies over the Middle East, something changed. For years, missiles and drones had moved in the shadows with no formal declaration of war. Tankers were hit at night in the Gulf. Scientists were assassinated on quiet Tehran streets. Ammo depots in Syria suddenly exploded without warning. Everyone knew the main antagonists were Iran and Israel. Yet neither admitted to a full-scale war. It was a chess game fought with proxies, cyber code, and deniable airstrikes. Then, in June 2025, the pretense cracked. Israeli jets struck deep into Iran, hitting nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. Iran responded with salvos of ballistic missiles and drones against Israeli cities and bases. For 12 days, the shadow war became a very real Iran-Israel war, fought openly across both countries before a fragile ceasefire pushed the conflict back into the gray zone. Yet even after the ceasefire, the Inferno did not die. It spread sideways. In Yemen, Iran backed Houthi forces that launched dozens of drones and anti-ship missiles into Red Sea shipping lanes, threatening one of the world's key trade arteries. In Lebanon and Syria, Hezbollah and other militias traded daily fire with Israel. In Iraq and Syria, Iran-aligned groups harassed U.S. forces. Meanwhile, inside Iran, mysterious explosions continued to hit refineries and bases after June 2025, with Tehran blaming accidents, while independent reporting pointed to likely sabotage. So what exactly is this shadow war? Why has Iran chosen to fight this way? Why has the region slid into a slow-burning inferno instead of a single decisive war? And after an overt clash in 2025, are we heading back to deniable conflict forever or toward something even worse? To answer those questions, we need to step back and dissect the architecture of this confrontation. Who are the real forces on each side? What weapons matter? How did Iran build a network of proxies stretching from Lebanon to Yemen? Why has Israel adapted with assassinations, cyber attacks, precision air power, and layered missile defense? And most importantly, what lessons does this multi-theater struggle hold for modern warfare? The starting point is Iran's revolution and the trauma that followed. In 1979, the Shah fell and the Islamic Republic was born. Within a year, Iran faced a brutal invasion by Saddam Hussein's Iraq. From 1980 to 1988, Iran fought a war that killed hundreds of thousands of its citizens under conditions of near total isolation. It had been cut off from U.S. weapons and training. Many of its Western-supplied systems degraded when spare parts stopped flowing. That war taught Tehran two brutal lessons. First, it could not rely on great powers for security. Second, it could not win a conventional force-on-force contest against a coalition of richer Arab states backed by the United States. When the Gulf War of 1991 showed Iran how quickly U.S. air power could dismantle Iraq's forces, the message was reinforced. If Iran met the U.S. or Israel on open, conventional terms, it would likely lose. From those experiences emerged a doctrine often summarized as forward defense. Rather than waiting to be attacked on its own soil, Iran would push confrontation outward, using partners and proxies to keep pressure away from its borders. It would invest in missiles, drones, and naval harassment capabilities in narrow waterways like the Strait of Hormuz. It would cultivate militias from Lebanon to Yemen to create what many analysts call the axis of resistance. Is this only ideology? No. It is also cold geography and economics. Iran sits between regional rivals like Saudi Arabia and historical foes like Iraq. It faces Israel across a land bridge that runs through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It has a long coastline, but only narrow exits to the world's sea lanes. It has less money than its adversaries, fewer modern aircraft, and decades of sanctions restricting weapons imports. Those structural disadvantages push Tehran toward asymmetric tools. If you cannot match a foe plane for plane, you look for ways to bleed them cheaply and at distance. There is also the nuclear file. Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty early, but both under the Shah and the Islamic Republic, it pursued nuclear capabilities that many outside observers saw as dual use. Western and Israeli intelligence assessed that Iran at various points preserved a military option, even as Tehran insisted on the peaceful nature of its program. Israel saw this as existential. Beginning around 2010, it allegedly launched a systematic campaign of cyber attacks, sabotage, and targeted killings against Iranian nuclear facilities and scientists. Operations like Stuxnet, which damaged centrifuges at Natanz, and a series of assassinations of nuclear personnel were part of an effort to push back Iran's program without starting a conventional war. So by the early 2010s, both sides were already in a kind of undeclared conflict. Iran built proxies and missiles to deter or retaliate. Israel used intelligence services and air power to destroy what it saw as critical capabilities before they could mature. The United States and Gulf Arab states sat on the edges of this duel, sometimes feeding it, sometimes trying to contain it. That background explains why the war tends to stay in the shadows. Each side wants to impose costs without crossing the threshold that triggers full-scale state-on-state annihilation. The result is a region where everything looks like peacetime on paper, but missile defense systems are on permanent alert, tankers transit in fear, and militias act as cutouts for state policy. To understand the shadow war, we need to compare the actual balance of forces. Not only Iran versus Israel, but Iran plus its network against Israel plus its allies. Start with money and conventional power. According to recent estimates based on SIPRI data, Iran's military spending in 2024 was about $7.9 billion US. Israel in the same year spent roughly $46.5 billion, a 65% jump due to the Gaza war and escalation with Hezbollah and Iran. In raw budget terms, Israel outspends Iran by a factor of about 6. That gap grows further if you include Gulf partners like Saudi Arabia, which devotes tens of billions per year to defense. On paper, that should make Iran the weaker player. Its air force relies heavily on aging U.S. aircraft from before 1979 and older Russian designs. Its navy is divided between a small conventional fleet and swarms of fast attack craft. It has no equivalent to Israel's modern fighter fleet, sophisticated air defenses, and world-class intelligence apparatus. So where does Iran get leverage? It gets it from 3 pillars: proxies and partners, missiles and drones, strategic geography and choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. Its network of militias provides manpower and local knowledge in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Its missile and drone arsenal gives it the ability to threaten bases and cities even without air superiority. Its maritime position allows it to harass global shipping and energy flows at relatively low cost. On the other side, Israel has its own multi-layer architecture, a high-tech air force able to reach across the region, missile defenses like Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow that can intercept rockets, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. An advanced cyber and intelligence ecosystem that has repeatedly penetrated Iranian networks and stolen or destroyed sensitive data. Then there are the proxies. Hezbollah in Lebanon is widely described as one of the world's most heavily armed non-state actors, with an estimated rocket and missile arsenal in the range of 130,000 systems by the early 2020s. Iran has historically provided around $700 million a year to Hezbollah, plus training and advanced weapons via the IRGC Quds force. In Gaza, Tehran has provided over $100 million annually to groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In Yemen, it has backed the Houthis with weapons, training, and technical assistance, enabling them to seize Sana'a and later to attack Red Sea shipping with missiles and drones. If you add the popular mobilization forces in Iraq and various militias in Syria, the Iranian camp can field tens of thousands of fighters spread across multiple fronts, often embedded in local societies and states. So the true comparison is not simply Iran versus Israel. It is Iran plus a distributed network of non-state forces versus Israel plus its alliance with the United States and quiet security understandings with some Arab states. The Israeli side brings much more technology, air power, and money, but far fewer total ground fighters and far less deniability. The Iranian side brings depth, deniability, ideological motivation, and the ability to impose costs region-wide. But its proxies are not always controllable, and its own homeland is more vulnerable to strategic airstrikes. Which side has the advantage? It depends on the domain. In conventional high-intensity warfare, we saw during June 2025 that Israel and the United States could inflict heavy damage on Iranian infrastructure and military assets, while intercepting a large share of Iranian missile attacks, albeit at great cost. In the gray zone of sabotage, terrorism, and proxy strikes, Iran has a long track record and global reach. This imbalance is one reason the conflict keeps oscillating between shadow and open war. Each side tries to fight where it is strongest and avoid the arena where the other enjoys dominance. To see how this plays out, we need to zoom into the actual tools of the shadow war. Not just armies, but specific platforms and tactics. Consider missiles and drones. Iran has spent decades building one of the region's largest arsenals of ballistic and cruise missiles. Systems like the Fateh, Zulfikar, and Qiyam give it ranges from hundreds to more than 1,000 kilometers, enough to threaten bases in the Gulf and targets in Israel. More recently, it has added cruise missiles and loitering munitions with improved accuracy. Drones are the most visible export of this effort. The Shahed family, especially the Shahed 131 and 136, are relatively cheap, propeller-driven loitering munitions that can be launched in swarms from trucks or ships. Iran has supplied variants to Russia for use in Ukraine and to its regional proxies. These systems are slow and noisy, but difficult to defend against in large numbers, particularly when mixed with faster missiles. The April 2024 direct Iranian attack on Israel, and later the June 2025 exchanges, demonstrated this concept in practice. Hundreds of drones and missiles were launched, many intercepted by a coalition that included Israel, the United States, and regional Arab states. But the attack forced Israel to expend expensive interceptor missiles and revealed how saturation tactics could stress even advanced air defenses. Iran's proxies mirror this toolkit at lower scale. Hezbollah fields large numbers of rockets and an increasing number of precision-guided systems. The Houthis have fired anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones against ships in the Red Sea, often using Iranian-origin technology. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency and other sources have documented repeated seizures of shipments with missile components heading to Houthi-controlled ports. On the defense side, Israel has layered systems. Iron Dome intercepts short-range rockets and some drones. David's Sling and Patriot batteries engage cruise and some ballistic threats. The Arrow system is designed to tackle longer-range ballistic missiles outside the atmosphere. During both the April 2024 and June 2025 attacks, these layers worked in concert, supported by U.S. and allied naval systems, to down many incoming threats. But the cost per interceptor is far higher than the cost of a Shahed drone or short-range rocket, creating an economic asymmetry. Then there is the maritime domain. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates swarms of small, fast boats armed with rockets and light anti-ship weapons. It has invested in naval mines, coastal cruise missiles, and underwater capabilities designed to threaten shipping in narrow waterways. This is a classic area denial strategy. Rather than trying to defeat U.S. or allied navies in a blue water battle, Iran aims to make key choke points too risky or too expensive to traverse. Through the Houthis, it has extended similar tactics to the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb. Since late 2023, Houthi forces have repeatedly fired anti-ship missiles and drones at commercial and military vessels, and seized at least one cargo ship, claiming to target ships linked to Israel, but in practice hitting many with no clear Israeli connection. U.S. and allied warships have had to intercept complex barrages involving dozens of drones and multiple missiles, turning the Red Sea into a live testbed of modern naval air defense. Cyber and covert operations are the third pillar. Israel, often in coordination with the United States, has conducted persistent cyber campaigns against Iranian infrastructure and nuclear facilities. Stuxnet, Dooku, Flame, and other malware targeted centrifuges and industrial systems. Iran has responded with its own Saudi Aramco in the past and probing critical infrastructure in the United States and elsewhere. At the same time, both sides engage in assassinations and sabotage. Israel is widely believed to have killed multiple IRGC officers and nuclear scientists inside Iran and Syria. Tehran has been linked to plots targeting dissidents and Israeli or Jewish targets abroad. These operations sit at the gray edge of war and espionage, designed to weaken the opponent without triggering full mobilization. What if these weapons did not exist? Without drones and missiles, Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders would be sharply reduced. Its proxies would still matter, but their deterrent effect against Israel would be weaker. Israel could, in theory, rely less on expensive air and missile defenses and more on conventional air superiority. Yet the opposite is also true. Without covert capabilities and missile defenses, Israel would have few tools short of open war to deal with Iran's nuclear and regional programs. In other words, the shadow war is not a sideshow. It is the dominant form of conflict because it suits the constraints and vulnerabilities of each actor. The shadow war has not been static. It has moved through distinct phases and turning points that reshaped capabilities and perceptions. One early demonstration was the 2006 Lebanon War. Hezbollah, backed and trained by Iran, fought Israel to a kind of bloody draw. It absorbed heavy bombardment, yet continued firing rockets until the ceasefire. For Iran, this was proof that a well-armed proxy could survive a direct clash with Israel and impose real costs. For Israel, it was a warning that non-state actors with access to modern anti-tank and anti-ship weapons, plus large rocket stocks, could challenge its deterrent power. The next phase was the nuclear sabotage and assassination campaign from 2010 onward. As we have seen, Stuxnet and related operations set back Iran's centrifuge program, while targeted killings removed key scientists such as Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2020. This showed that Israel, possibly with U.S. support, could reach deep into Iranian territory. But it did not end the program. Instead, it pushed Iran to harden facilities, go underground, and diversify. Syria and Iraq became the third arena. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iran quickly exploited the power vacuum. The IRGC Quds Force built ties with Shia militias that later became the Popular Mobilization Forces, embedding Iranian influence into the Iraqi security architecture. When the Arab Spring and Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, Iran moved to rescue the Assad regime, deploying IRGC officers and mobilizing Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and later Afghan and Pakistani fighters to sustain the Syrian government. Russia's 2015 air intervention complemented this ground-based network. For Israel, this created a nightmare. It now faced Iranian-backed forces not only in Lebanon, but across the Golan frontier and inside Syria. The response was the so-called campaign between wars, repeated low-visibility airstrikes on weapons convoys, depots, and IRGC positions designed to prevent advanced missiles and air defenses from taking root near Israel's borders. Open-source timelines document dozens of such strikes from 2013 onward. Then came Yemen and the Maritime Front. From roughly 2014 onward, as the Houthis seized Sana'a and Saudi-led forces intervened, Iran deepened its support to the movement. Over time, Houthi units deployed increasingly sophisticated missiles and drones, some with clear Iranian fingerprints in design and components. This allowed Tehran to threaten Saudi oil infrastructure and later world shipping through a partner that could plausibly claim to be acting on its own. By the late 2010s, the cumulative effect was a region ringed by Iranian-aligned forces. Hezbollah to the north of Israel, Syrian militias and IRGC assets to the northeast, Iraqi militias able to threaten U.S. forces and logistics corridors, Houthis at the southwestern maritime gateway, Palestinian factions in Gaza, some with Iranian support, facing Israel from the coastal enclave. The 2019 tanker attacks and strike on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil facility signaled another phase, in which Iran used precision drones and cruise missiles to hit economic targets while staying just below the threshold for a U.S. war. The killing of Qasem Soleimani in a U.S. drone strike near Baghdad airport in January 2020 should have been a major strategic shock for Tehran. It removed the architect of much of Iran's proxy network. Yet the structures he built persisted. Iran responded with a limited ballistic missile strike on U.S. bases in Iraq, injuring dozens but deliberately avoiding American deaths, a calibrated retaliation that signaled both resolve and caution. The next great inflection came in October 2023 with Hamas's massive attack on Israel and the subsequent Gaza war. That assault was not simply a local outburst. It triggered a region-wide activation of Iran-backed or Iran-aligned groups. Hezbollah escalated cross-border fire. Iraqi and Syrian militias targeted U.S. bases. The Houthis began their campaign against Red Sea shipping, justifying it as solidarity with Gaza. Yet even then, Iran avoided fully unleashing all fronts in a coordinated fashion. Analysts noted that while the axis of resistance trumpeted a unity of fronts narrative, actual Iranian control was more cautious. Proxies attacked, but often at symbolic or limited levels. Tehran appeared reluctant to risk a direct clash with Israel and the United States. That restraint broke in April 2024, when Iran launched a direct, large-scale strike on Israel using a mix of drones and missiles, following Israeli attacks on Iranian officers and facilities. An even more intense exchange followed in June 2025, when Israel decided to mount major airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military assets, and Iran responded with barrages on Israeli cities and bases. The war lasted only 12 days, but caused heavy economic and military damage on both sides. In Israel, the cost of missile defenses, mobilization, and reconstruction ran into the equivalent of billions of dollars. In Iran, strikes hit refineries, military bases, and elements of the nuclear infrastructure, though hardened underground sites likely survived. Then, almost as quickly as it started, the overt phase ended. A ceasefire took hold. Within weeks, explosions inside Iran and renewed proxy attacks from places like Yemen signaled that the war had simply shifted back into the shadows. Why did it snap back? Because prolonged open war exposed both sides' vulnerabilities. Iran could not reliably protect its infrastructure and political centers from air attack. Israel could not sustain the economic and social cost of living under mass missile fire while fighting in Gaza and Lebanon at the same time. Neither side achieved decisive victory. The lesson for both was paradoxical. Use overt war sparingly. Exploit the shadow war constantly. Given this history, what are the deeper lessons militaries and policymakers should draw from Iran's shadow war and the wider Middle East inferno? First, the power and limits of proxy warfare. Iran's proxy strategy has undeniably extended its reach. From a relatively isolated state in 1979, it has built influence in at least 6 regional arenas. Its proxies have forced Israel to fight on multiple fronts and constrained U.S. freedom of action in Iraq and Syria. U.S. government estimates suggest Tehran spent more than $16 billion between 2012 and 2020 supporting the Assad regime and its proxy network. plus hundreds of millions per year to groups like Hezbollah and Palestinian factions. But proxies are not robots. Hezbollah has its own Lebanese interests. Iraqi militias are embedded in domestic politics. The Houthis pursue Yemeni power as much as Iranian regional goals. During the Gaza war and subsequent escalation, analysts observed that Iran sometimes hesitated even as its partners pushed for more aggressive action, revealing gaps between Tehran's rhetoric and its risk tolerance. That raises a question. What happens when proxies drag a patron into a war it did not want? The June 2025 Iran-Israel war was triggered in part by the cumulative logic of years of proxy pressure and Israeli responses. Once Hezbollah's leadership was hit hard and Iranian personnel were repeatedly targeted in Syria, Iran's space to sit back shrank. The architecture it had built to keep war away from its territory instead created escalation paths back to its homeland. Second, the economics of missile defense and offense. The shadow war is a running experiment in cost-exchange ratios. A Shahed-type drone may cost tens of thousands of dollars. An interceptor missile from systems like David's Sling or Arrow can cost hundreds of thousands or more. When Iran or its proxies launch large volleys, even if most are intercepted, the defender spends far more money per engagement. Over time, this can strain even wealthy states. This dynamic pushes defenders toward cheaper solutions: electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, point defense guns, improved passive protection and redundancy. It also encourages offensive efforts to destroy launch sites, production facilities, and logistical chains before threats are fired. Israel's persistent campaign against weapons convoys in Syria and U.S.-led interdictions of Iranian arms shipments to Yemen are examples of this preemptive logic. Third, the strategic value of choke points. By empowering the Houthis, Iran gained the ability to disrupt a maritime artery through which significant global trade, including energy, passes. Even limited attacks prompted rerouting of ships around the Cape of Good Hope, adding time and cost to supply chains. Western navies had to devote destroyers, frigates, and aircraft to defend commercial shipping against low-cost drones and missiles. This is a textbook asymmetric move. For relatively modest investment, a weaker state uses a non-state ally to force much stronger powers to spend heavily on protection and to accept global economic risk. It is also a warning. Other choke points, from Hormuz to the Taiwan Strait, could see similar tactics. Fourth, the resilience and vulnerability of domestic fronts. Iran's regime has survived decades of sanctions, political unrest, and external pressure. Israel's society has withstood heavy rocket fire, terrorism, and now direct missile strikes from Iran. Yet neither is invulnerable. Economic shocks from war, visible failures of defense, and political polarization can erode long-term staying power. Reports after the June 2025 war highlighted high economic costs in Israel and political debate about preparedness and strategy. Iran faces its own internal strains, with analysts describing growing dissatisfaction within the IRGC and broader society after repeated setbacks and the visible damage from Israeli strikes. For external observers, the lesson is simple. In protracted shadow conflicts, domestic cohesion and economic resilience may matter more than the number of missiles in inventory. Finally, there is the lesson about thresholds. For years, the Iran-Israel conflict was largely managed below the level of open state-on-state war. Targeted killings, cyber operations, and proxy skirmishes were considered acceptable. The April 2024 and June 2025 episodes showed how quickly that boundary can dissolve when cumulative pressures build. Once large missile salvos fly between homelands, the risk of miscalculation and systemic escalation, including nuclear, becomes real. Paradoxically, after such a scare, both sides may double down on shadow methods to avoid repeating that experience. That is why some analysts argue the war has now returned to the shadows, with renewed emphasis on deniable attacks, sabotage, and proxy action rather than open salvos between capitals. But shadow wars are not safe just because they are not formally declared. They accumulate grievances. They normalize the use of terrorism, cyber disruption, and economic coercion. They make misidentification and escalation more likely because attribution is murky. And they spread. What began as a struggle over Iranian revolution and Israeli security now affects shipping insurance in Europe, energy prices in Asia, and domestic politics in Washington and Gulf capitals. Where does this leave the Middle East today? We have a region in which the main contestants understand one another's strengths and weaknesses with painful clarity. Iran knows it cannot win a conventional slugfest against a coalition of Israel, the United States, and well-armed Arab states. Israel knows it cannot survive in the long term if Iranian-backed forces are able to encircle it with precision missiles, and if Iran's nuclear program crosses certain thresholds. As a result, both sides will likely continue to prioritize tools that fit this gray space. Iran will try to rebuild and adapt its proxy networks despite recent setbacks and internal doubts about their cost-effectiveness. Israel will continue to strike in Syria, interdict shipments to Lebanon and Yemen, and use intelligence and cyber means inside Iran. The Houthis, Hezbollah, and others will adjust tactics based on the successes and failures of their recent campaigns. Could diplomacy short-circuit this dynamic? The history of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and its collapse suggests that nuclear agreements can slow one dimension of the conflict, but do not automatically unwind the proxy wars or ideological rivalry. Moreover, after the 2023 Gaza war and the 2025 Iran-Israel clashes, domestic politics on both sides make concessions harder. What is more likely is a pattern of cyclical escalation, periods of intense but still deniable violence, occasional short, frightening bursts of open warfare like June 2025, then a return to shadow conflict as both sides step back from the brink. From a military analytic perspective, the Iran shadow war offers a preview of how future great and regional power competitions may look. Saturation drone and missile attacks against cities and bases. Proxies wielding near state-level firepower. Cyber strikes on critical infrastructure. Maritime disruption at global chokepoints. Wars fought as much in deniable space as in declared battlefields. The question for strategists is not whether this pattern is desirable. It is clearly dangerous. The question is how to manage it. How do you harden societies against constant low-level threat without exhausting them? How do you sanction and deter state use of proxies without inadvertently collapsing fragile states that host those proxies? How do you design air and missile defenses that are affordable against large numbers of cheap attackers? How do you maintain clear red lines in a domain built on plausible deniability? If Iran's shadow war has taught anything, it is that ignoring gray zone aggression does not make it go away. It accumulates until it bursts into open conflict. But treating every proxy attack as a direct act of war by the patron risks triggering the very full-scale war that all sides fear. Navigating between these extremes requires not only military tools, but careful statecraft and a realistic understanding of each actor's motivations and limits. For Iran, the path ahead will test whether its leaders can recalibrate a strategy built on exporting revolution and resistance into one that preserves regime survival amid economic pressure and domestic dissent. For Israel, it will test whether military superiority and layers of defense can be translated into lasting strategic security rather than a cycle of short-term wins and long-term instability. For the wider Middle East, it will determine whether the region remains a cockpit of proxy wars or edges toward a more stable balance of power, perhaps underwritten by new alignments and understandings. The Inferno is unlikely to go out soon, but understanding the structure of the Iran shadow war helps explain the sparks, the fuel, and the winds that keep it alive. It shows why drones over the Red Sea, explosions in Damascus, cyber outages in Tehran, and missile interceptions over Jerusalem are all connected. They are not isolated incidents. They are moves in a long-running, multi-domain contest over regional order. The final uncomfortable truth is this: as long as shadow methods remain cheap and effective for weaker actors, and as long as stronger actors prefer covert tools to expensive occupations and invasions, the gray zone will remain crowded. The Middle East is simply the most advanced laboratory for this kind of conflict. Other regions are watching, taking notes, and quietly building their own arsenals of proxies, drones, and deniable capabilities. Whether that future resembles managed competition or chronic chaos will depend on choices still to be made. But the lessons from Iran's shadow war are already there for anyone willing to study them. If we look beneath the visible clashes and missile salvos, what really sustains this long war in the shadows is logistics and organization. Guns, rockets, and drones are only the tip of the iceberg. Underneath, there is a constant flow of money, materiel, training, and intelligence that keeps the entire network functioning across thousands of kilometers. Iran's approach to logistics is fundamentally different from a classic state-army model. A conventional force concentrates stockpiles in large depots, feeds them forward along clear lines of supply, and depends on relatively transparent infrastructure. By contrast, Tehran has built a distributed, deniable logistics architecture that runs through commercial front companies, charitable associations, local political parties, religious organizations, and covert smuggling networks. This is not accidental improvisation. It is a deliberate response to its vulnerabilities. Big depots are easy to bomb. Marked military convoys are simple to track. Formal state-to-state arms transfers are easy to sanction. So Iran pushes as much as possible into gray channels that are harder to attack without causing collateral diplomatic and economic damage. In practice, this means weapons and components move in small lots. Missile guidance kits can be shipped as innocuous electronics. Drone engines can be bought on the civilian market, routed through multiple intermediaries, and only assembled near the front line. Local allies are encouraged to develop their own manufacturing capacity. Hezbollah in Lebanon and Houthi forces in Yemen do not depend solely on fully finished weapons arriving from Iran. They receive designs, key components, and technical advisors. Then they adapt to local industry and materials. This makes the logistic network more resilient. Even if a particular ship, convoy, or warehouse is destroyed, the knowledge and partial supply base remain. Israel and its partners try to attack this network at every stage. Intelligence services monitor airports, seaports, and land corridors where shipments might transit. Air forces strike suspected depots, workshops, and convoys when the political cost is manageable. Diplomats press transit states to tighten controls or allow inspections. Customs and financial regulators track suspicious front companies and attempt to cut them off from global banking systems. The campaign between wars targeting infrastructure in Syria is only one visible manifestation of a much wider economic and intelligence battle. Yet the more Israel and its partners target obvious nodes, the more Iran is incentivized to fragment and decentralize. Instead of one large workshop, there are 10 small ones. Instead of one big shipment, there are countless smaller cargoes. From a purely military perspective, this is inefficient. Economies of scale are lost. But from a survivability perspective, it makes sense. Dispersal trades efficiency for resilience. In a shadow war where your adversary has air superiority and global reach, resilience matters more than neatness. There is also a political layer in logistics. By embedding supply chains inside sympathetic communities, Iran makes any attempt to disrupt them politically costly. Militias run social services, charities, and reconstruction projects. Warehouses are near civilian housing. Workshops are tucked into urban zones where strikes carry high risk of civilian casualties. This blurs lines between military and civilian infrastructure and complicates targeting decisions for Israel or Western states that care about global opinion. Every precision strike is weighed not only in terms of physical effect, but in terms of reputational and political fallout. This raises a core strategic question. In a world where logistic networks hide inside civilian life, how can a technologically superior state degrade an adversary's capacities without eroding its own legitimacy over time? Israel has faced that dilemma in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Syria. The more it succeeds tactically, the more it risks strategic isolation if civilian harm mounts. Iran understands this tension and designs its networks accordingly. Intelligence is the second invisible pillar of the shadow war. Without precise information, neither targeted assassinations nor surgical strikes nor cyber operations are possible. Both Iran and Israel invest heavily in this domain, but their methods and priorities are different. For Israel, intelligence is the primary compensator for small size and hostile surroundings. It needs to know what is being shipped where, who is meeting whom, which underground facility is active, and which commander is about to move. It has built a dense architecture of human intelligence networks, signals interception, cyber penetration, satellite imagery, and airborne surveillance. This apparatus is integrated tightly with decision-making. When a weapons convoy is detected in Syria, an airstrike can often be greenlit on short notice. When a key IRGC officer appears in an exposed location, a drone or missile strike can follow rapidly. The rhythm of this intelligence-to-strike cycle is a defining feature of the campaign between wars. Iran also runs extensive intelligence operations, but with a different focus. Its services are tasked with several goals at once. They must monitor internal dissent and regime opponents. They must watch regional adversaries, especially Israel, the United States, and Gulf monarchies. They must coordinate with and sometimes discipline a diverse set of proxies and partners. And they must conduct covert operations abroad, including surveillance of dissidents and potential targets for retaliation. This breadth of mission stretches resources and creates trade-offs. Every operative assigned to watch a student movement or a clerical rival inside Iran is an operative not watching a foreign airbase or naval task force. In the shadow war, the most painful intelligence failures tend to appear suddenly. A depot explodes unexpectedly. A clandestine meeting is hit at the exact moment when senior figures are present. A secret program is exposed when documents leak or a cyber intrusion reveals its structure. For the target, such events do not simply destroy material assets. They also send a psychological message. Someone is inside your system. They know more than you thought. Trust fractures within organizations. Counterintelligence purges follow, which themselves degrade operational efficiency. Yet intelligence cuts both ways. Iranian-aligned groups have shown an ability to collect and exploit targeting information in conflicts against Israel, U.S. forces, and Gulf states. The use of simple but proliferated surveillance drones, spotters on the ground, and interception of poorly secured communications allows even non-state actors to improve their fire control. The more technology saturates the battle space, the more data is available for exploitation by any actor with minimal skills and tools. One subtle but crucial aspect of this intelligence contest is narrative control. Both camps run information operations to shape perceptions of events. When a senior commander is killed, the messaging around whether he was targeted in a foreign airstrike, died in an accident, or was a victim of internal intrigue matters for morale and domestic politics. Claims of responsibility, denials, and carefully leaked details are part of the battlefield. In a shadow war, the truth about who hit what and why often emerges only partially and after delays. This ambiguity is not a byproduct, it is a weapon. The comparison with other conflicts helps highlight what is distinctive about the Iran-centered shadow war. In an open conventional conflict between large states, such as the fighting in Eastern Europe, intelligence supports mass artillery strikes, armor movements, and large-scale offensives. Losses are visible. Front lines are mapped. In the Iran-Israel context, front lines are blurry. Many engagements occur far from any declared battlefield. Clear victory or defeat in individual episodes is less important than the cumulative effect on perception and deterrence. A single spectacular strike can alter risk calculations more than dozens of routine skirmishes. The political dimension of the Shadow War is often underappreciated by military analysts, yet it may be decisive. Neither Iran nor Israel fights in a vacuum. Every move is filtered through domestic politics, regional alignments, and great power competition. Inside Iran, the regime presents the confrontation as part of a broader narrative of resistance against Western hegemony and Zionism. This framing justifies heavy investment in missiles, drones, and proxy forces, even when the domestic economy is strained. But it also creates a trap. When leaders promise constant resistance, stepping back or compromising becomes politically difficult. If a high-profile attack on Iranian territory goes unanswered, hardline factions can accuse the leadership of weakness. This dynamic helps explain why Tehran sometimes authorizes visible retaliation even when the military balance argues for restraint. Face and ideological consistency matter. In Israel, the political landscape is fragmented and highly contentious. Security policy is interwoven with debates about settlements, relations with Palestinians, the role of religion in politics, and civil-military relations. Disagreements over how to handle Gaza, how to prioritize the Iranian nuclear file, and how to manage relations with the United States and Arab neighbors all shape decision-making. A government perceived as too soft on Iran can face backlash from voters and rivals. On the other hand, a leadership that triggers a large war without clear benefits can rapidly lose public support. The short, intense Iran-Israel war showed both how quickly Israeli society can mobilize and how swiftly questions about cost and strategy emerge afterward. Regionally, the Shadow War overlays a shifting landscape of alliances. Some Arab states see Iran as the main threat and view quiet or open cooperation with Israel as a necessary hedge. Others remain publicly hostile to Israel but quietly wary of Iranian influence as well. Great powers use the conflict as a lever. Support for one side or the other can be exchanged for energy deals, arms contracts, or diplomatic concessions. All of this means that every escalation between Iran and Israel is immediately assessed by surrounding states through the lens of their own rivalries and dependencies. This environment creates opportunities for leverage and for miscalculation. Iran can threaten to activate proxies against Gulf states to deter them from cooperating with Israel. Israel can hint that deeper normalization with certain Arab regimes depends on their stance toward Iran. External powers can use arms deliveries, sanctions, or diplomatic cover to reward or punish behavior. But the more actors become entangled, the harder it is to control escalation. A strike intended as a narrow message to one player might trigger a cascade of reactions through various partners. Political narratives also influence how much punishment societies are willing to endure. A population that believes it is fighting for survival will tolerate more hardship than one that sees a conflict as optional. Iranian and Israeli leaders both portray their struggle as existential. For Tehran, it is about independence, regional influence, and the survival of the Islamic Republic. For Israel, it is about physical survival in a hostile environment and preventing an adversary from acquiring a nuclear capability that could fundamentally alter the balance. This mutually existential framing hardens positions and makes compromise at the strategic level extremely difficult. A useful way to analyze the Iran Shadow War is to view it through the lens of military domains. Land, air, sea, cyber, and space each play specific roles, and cross-domain effects are deliberate, not accidental. On land, the key actors are not armored divisions facing each other across borders. Instead, they are militias, special forces, and limited contingents of regular troops. Urban terrain dominates. Militias operate within and among civilian populations, using tunnels, safe houses, and dense neighborhoods. Regular state forces backstop them, but often prefer to remain just outside the most contested zones to preserve deniability. Because open conventional battles on land would expose Iran's comparative weakness, it favors guerrilla tactics, improvised explosive devices, and hit-and-run attacks by partners. Israel, by contrast, tries to limit ground exposure and leverage air power and precision standoff fires whenever possible. In the air domain, Israel currently enjoys superiority in terms of modern platforms, training, and integration. Its aircraft can reach most regional targets with aerial refueling and have proven capable of operating in heavily defended airspace when political decisions allow it. Iran's air defenses have improved, but remain vulnerable to sophisticated suppression campaigns. As a result, Iran leans more on missiles and drones, which can complicate air defense even if they are not survivable as platforms in the traditional sense. The most important contest in the air is therefore between offensive missile and drone salvos and layered defensive systems that must engage them under time pressure and at high cost. At sea, the asymmetry is even more pronounced. Iran cannot match Western or Israeli naval forces ship for ship, so it emphasizes fast attack craft, mines, land-based anti-ship missiles, and expendable drones. The aim is not to sink enemy fleets decisively in blue water battles. It is to raise the risk and cost of transit through narrow passages to the point where commercial and military planners are forced to reroute or negotiate. The Houthis play a similar role in the Red Sea on Iran's behalf. Israel, Western navies, and some regional states counter with high-end warships equipped with advanced radar and missile defenses. Again, the cost exchange tends to favor the attacker using cheap drones against expensive naval interceptors. In cyberspace, both sides enjoy certain advantages. Israel has a mature tech sector and long-standing cooperation with Western partners. It uses this ecosystem to develop offensive and defensive cyber tools aimed at critical infrastructure, military networks, and intelligence targets. Iran has developed a large pool of cyber operators as well. They focus on disruptive attacks, espionage, and influence operations, targeting not only Israel but also Gulf states, Western countries, and dissident communities. In this domain, the barriers to entry are relatively low compared to the cost of building air forces or navies. Although sophisticated operations still require high skill, many disruptive actions can be carried out by small teams with modest resources. Space plays a quieter but essential role. Satellite imagery, communications, and navigation influence every other domain. States that can tap into commercial imagery or allied intelligence gain an edge in planning strikes and monitoring movements. Jam-resistant and resilient communication systems allow forces to maintain coordination even under attack. Iran has sought to develop its own space launch and satellite capabilities, partly for prestige and partly to reduce dependence on foreign systems. Israel relies heavily on cooperation with Western space assets while also maintaining its own limited capabilities. When all these domains are linked, the shadow war becomes a multi-dimensional system. A drone launched by a proxy group at sea might be guided by coordinates derived from satellite data. Its detection might trigger a cyber operation to blind a radar temporarily, combined with airstrikes on a coastal launcher. Information about the result will flow back through secure networks, feeding future decision cycles. From the outside, this can look chaotic and reactive. In reality, both camps are constantly trying to improve the integration of these domains to generate disproportionate effects. A natural question arises when examining this complex architecture. Is the shadow war actually achieving what its architects hope? For Iran, has the investment in proxies, drones, and missiles bought real security and leverage? For Israel, has the heavy emphasis on preemptive strikes, layered defenses, and covert action delivered long-term strategic advantage? From Iran's perspective, the answer is mixed. On the positive side, the regime has avoided direct invasion or regime change despite decades of hostility from powerful adversaries. Its influence now reaches into various neighboring states, and it can credibly threaten to disrupt regional trade and energy flows. Its proxies have drawn Israeli and Western attention and resources away from Iran's own borders. In that sense, the forward defense strategy has worked. However, the costs are high. Sanctions linked to Iran's regional activities and missile program have damaged its economy. Associating closely with militias that many in the region view as destabilizing has strained relations with some neighbors. Proxies sometimes act in ways that complicate Tehran's diplomacy or force responses that the leadership might not otherwise choose. Furthermore, the June 2025 war demonstrated that forward defense does not guarantee safety at home. Despite all the proxies, Iran still suffered heavy direct strikes on its territory. From Israel's perspective, preemptive and preventive strategies have delayed certain threats and prevented others from maturing fully. Covert operations have reportedly disrupted aspects of Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Airstrikes have limited the quality and quantity of advanced weapons reaching Hezbollah and other groups. Layered defenses have saved lives and maintained a sense of relative normality under rocket and missile fire that would otherwise be intolerable. Yet strategic success remains elusive. Iran's regional network is still intact, even if degraded in parts. Missile threats have grown in volume and reach despite interceptions. The nuclear file continues to generate crisis after crisis. Israel is forced into a posture of perpetual vigilance, reactive operations, and periodic high-intensity clashes. Both sides are therefore trapped in what could be called a stability of exhaustion. Neither can easily escalate to outright annihilation without unacceptable risk. Neither can fully disengage without feeling dangerously exposed. The shadow war is the compromise. It allows both to attack and defend, to signal and retaliate without crossing certain thresholds most of the time. But it does so at a constant price in tension, resources, and uncertainty. This pattern has implications beyond the Middle East. Other states watching the conflict may draw the lesson that building cheap standoff weapons and cultivating proxies is an effective way to deter stronger opponents. They may also learn that being on the receiving end of such tactics demands continuous investments in intelligence, missile defense, and cybersecurity that constrain even wealthy economies. If many states adopt similar playbooks, future wars will be less about tank offensives and more about long-range strikes, deniable attacks, and contested gray zones. It is also important to consider hypothetical divergences. What if certain technological or political shifts occur? How would they alter the shadow war? Imagine that defensive technology suddenly becomes much cheaper and more effective against drones and missiles. Directed energy weapons, low-cost interceptors, and advanced electronic warfare might drastically reduce the cost exchange advantage currently enjoyed by attackers. In such a scenario, Iran's emphasis on swarms of relatively inexpensive munitions would lose some of its strategic value. Tehran might then have to invest more in high-end precision systems, submarines, or cyber capabilities, or else accept diminished deterrence. Proxies relying on rockets and simple drones would also see their impact reduced. The shadow war would not end, but its firepower profile would change. Conversely, consider a world where offensive technology outpaces defense further. If new generations of hypersonic or stealthy systems make interception very difficult, states like Israel would face even greater pressure on their defensive architecture. They would be pushed toward more extreme preemption and even deeper integration with great power partners for strategic defense. The temptation to launch disabling strikes before adversaries can field such systems might increase, raising escalation risks. Political shocks can be just as disruptive as technological ones. A major internal upheaval in Iran could weaken central control over proxies, leading to fragmentation and unpredictable violence as local commanders seek new sponsors or act autonomously. Alternatively, a faction that prioritizes economic relief over ideological confrontation might try to rein in external activities. That could open windows for de-escalation, but also generate resistance from entrenched networks that benefit from the status quo. On the Israeli side, a dramatic political realignment or a rethinking of long-term security strategy could alter priorities. If a future leadership concluded that managing the Palestinian issue differently would reduce the appeal of Iranian-backed narratives, it might adjust its regional posture. On the other hand, a leadership under extreme domestic pressure might resort to more aggressive regional actions to reassert deterrence and unity, risking broader conflict. There is also the question of external great powers. If a major power decided to offer Iran binding security guarantees in exchange for limitations on certain programs, that might change Tehran's calculus about proxies and missile threats. If the United States or another actor reduced its engagement in the region sharply, local states would be forced into new alignments and calculations. In such a vacuum, the temptation for decisive actions might grow. These scenarios are not predictions. They are stress tests that highlight how fragile the current equilibrium can be. The shadow war looks stable because it has persisted for years, but it rests on assumptions about risk tolerance, external support, and technological balances that could shift. The final analytical layer is the human one. Strategic concepts and military technologies are ultimately shaped by the people who design and implement them. The Iran shadow war has produced a generation of commanders, operatives, and policymakers on all sides who are steeped in its logic. Within Iran's security establishment, veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, the interventions in Iraq and Syria, and the building of proxy networks hold significant influence. Their experiences teach them that resilience and patience can outlast superior firepower. They have seen adversaries abandon occupations or shift priorities over time. This reinforces a strategic culture that values endurance, ideological commitment, and incremental gains over quick victories. At the same time, those experiences may create blind spots. Overconfidence in the power of proxies, underestimation of internal discontent, and a tendency to view every compromise as a slippery slope to surrender. On the Israeli side, many officers and analysts have lived through multiple wars and operations against both state and non-state foes. They have watched how underestimating an adversary's determination or adaptation can lead to costly surprises. This produces a cautious aggressiveness, a preference for acting early and with precision, coupled with deep concern about long-term entanglement. It also fosters a constant search for technological solutions that can tilt the balance in Israel's favor without requiring large ground commitments. Across the region, populations in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, and Israel itself have absorbed the human cost of this protracted struggle. For some communities, affiliation with a proxy militia brings protection, income, and a sense of identity. For others, it means living near targets and under the shadow of possible retaliation. In Israel, repeated mobilizations and rocket barrages stress society and economy. The psychological weight of always expecting the next escalation shapes political attitudes and risk perceptions. These human factors matter because they determine how leaders interpret threats and opportunities. A commander who has seen colleagues killed in covert strikes is more likely to push for retaliatory actions that may not be strictly rational in cost-benefit terms. A politician who fears electoral punishment for appearing weak may support escalations that a detached strategist would avoid. A militia leader whose power rests on continuous resistance will resist any settlement that threatens his position. Thus, the shadow war is sustained not only by structural forces, but by habits, memories, and fears. Breaking out of it would require not just new policies, but changes in how key actors think about security and legitimacy. Taken together, all these layers present a sobering picture. The Iran shadow war is not a temporary anomaly. It is the expression of deep strategic logic under contemporary technological and political conditions. As long as those conditions persist, the Middle East inferno will continue to flare and smolder in cycles. For military professionals and analysts, the conflict is a critical case study in modern, multi-domain, multi-actor warfare. It shows how a state with limited conventional power can leverage geography, ideology, and cheap standoff weapons to shape its environment. It demonstrates how a technologically advanced state can use intelligence, precision, and layered defense to manage threats without always resorting to all-out war. It highlights the limits of both approaches when confronted by resilient adversaries and complex societies. For policymakers, the key lesson is that strategy cannot treat the shadow war as background noise. Every drone strike on a shipping lane, every mysterious explosion at a depot, every cyber intrusion into a power grid contributes to a cumulative strategic narrative. Ignoring these signals can lead to surprise when an apparently stable gray zone suddenly tips into open conflict. Overreacting to them can drag states into escalations they did not intend. Managing this balance requires steady intelligence, realistic assessments of interests, and carefully calibrated responses. For societies caught in the middle, the challenge is survival with dignity. Communities in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, and Israel will continue to bear the brunt of kinetic exchanges, economic disruption, and political strain. Their experiences will shape future generations' attitudes toward war and peace. If they come to see violence as the only reliable currency of power, the shadow war will replicate itself endlessly. If they manage to build alternative paths to security and prosperity that loosen the grip of armed factions and external patrons, the space for de-escalation may slowly expand. In the end, the Iran shadow war is about more than missiles in the night or tankers dodging drones. It is about how states adapt when they cannot get what they want through either pure diplomacy or decisive conventional war. It is about the creative but dangerous ways power is projected in an interconnected world where every action is watched, measured, and spun. And it is about the risks that emerge when the line between war and peace is deliberately blurred for years at a time. Understanding this conflict does not guarantee that it can be ended quickly or cleanly. But without such understanding, attempts to intervene, deter, or mediate are likely to make things worse rather than better. The Middle East inferno around Iran and its adversaries is a warning about the future of conflict more broadly. Fire may start in one corner of the region, but the smoke spreads far beyond.